South Korea's defense industry has been thriving, with remarkable advances in technology resulting in overseas deals tailored to accommodate the unique security challenges faced by each prospective buyer. So what is the size of its defense exports this year? What are the details behind South Korea's defense deals with countries like Australia and Poland? And what factors are fueling the country's exports of defense equipment? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. On this Tuesday edition, we delve into the Yoon administration's intentions to make South Korea one of the world's top 4 weapons suppliers. For more, I have Kwon Soa here in the studio. Soa, it's good to have you here.
Good to be here in the studio with you, Sunny.
I also have Tom Corben at the U.S. Studies Center in the University of Sydney, live on the line. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Right, so let's start here in the studio then. Let's begin with a few facts and figures about South Korea's defense-related exports for this year.
Let's start with the figure $20 billion as South Korea's defense exports may exceed that number, and that according to a recent outlook. That is, if a number of contracts in the remainder of the year go through. Now, what we can say with more certainty is the South Korean government's goal of $15 billion may be passed, because based on figures last month, arms exports already topped $10 billion this year, and with that, the previous year's record of around $7 billion has already been reached. But last year was also a very significant year, because if you take a look at the figures on the graph, it's been already a big jump from the previous years, where we had around a $3 billion level of exports. So also, it's the first time last year that outbound shipments surpassed imports of defense-related equipment. And if you look at the 5-year span from 2017 to 2021, Korea's arms exports grew almost 180%. So that's the fastest growth pace that we're seeing compared to other top 10 weapons export powerhouses. And if we make a comparison, for instance, Australia and France saw a growth of a little under 160% during the same 5 years compared to the previous 5 years. And this development is attributed to massive deals with countries like Australia, the UAE, Egypt, and quite recently a multi-billion deal with Poland. So the country's presence in this market has expanded beyond Asia. So we're seeing another K industry, if I may say, is in the spotlight, with the country's arsenal exports in volume likely to surpass that of China and Germany this year, making Korea then the world's 4th largest defense exporter, only behind the U.S., Russia, and France.
Right, and against that backdrop, Tom, back in August, you co-authored a piece on what you described as KArsenal. Now, you chose to highlight South Korea's defense deal with Australia as perhaps proof of its remarkable advances in the global trade of arms. Would you like to explain that?
Sure. So there's probably 2 parts to explain here. The first is the reason why we picked the term KArsenal. It's a play on words from a famous Teddy Roosevelt line in the context of the Second World War, where he said that the US, quote, must become the arsenal of democracy. In the current context of the war in Ukraine, waged by Russia, the framing of this conflict by many in the United States is one of democracy versus autocracy. And given efforts by many countries in Asia and Europe to modernize and expand their militaries at a rapid pace, my co-author Peter Lee and I decided to use the term KArsenal to refer to what we see as South Korea's growing capacity and its willingness, quite frankly, to supply advanced military equipment to a range of countries in need across the globe, but particularly in Asia and Europe. Now, the second part to explain here is why we chose the case study of Australia. And the recent success of Korean defense firms in Australia, we argue, is a case in point of the above. But it's particularly significant because it shows that Korea is capable and willing of offering more advanced and strategically relevant capabilities to key US allies who are on the front lines of Chinese and Russian coercion. Now, Hanwha Defence in Australia has, of course, secured a $1 billion Australian deal for 30 howitzers, and it's a leading contender for a separate contract for, I think it's for 450 armoured fighting vehicles, which is yet to be decided. What's more significant to me and to my co-author is, from an Australian perspective at least, is that the same company has since offered to supply Australia with advanced submarines and something that many people say is an equivalent to the US HIMARS rocket system that we've seen be so effective in Ukraine. So regardless of whether these offers are even taken up, to me, it's still a clear sign that South Korea is not only more willing, but it's also increasingly capable of supplying these sorts of advanced systems to countries that really matter to the United States and, quite frankly, to South Korea as well.
Right, and staying with specific countries, so you mentioned South Korea's defense deal with Poland. What are the details of that particular deal?
Well, Poland is purchasing tanks, jets, and howitzers from Korea. In detail, the arms deal includes 48 FA-50 light combat aircraft manufactured by the Korea Aerospace Industries, 980 K2 Black Panther battle tanks developed by Hyundai Rodam, and 648 K9 self-propelled howitzers from Hanwha Defense. Speaking of money terms, all of this is part of a broad deal or framework agreement worth around 14 billion US dollars. So that makes the biggest ever deal for South Korea. And South Korea and Poland reached this agreement in late July, following which there were 3 executive contracts or fulfillment contracts for each of the equipment under which details were signed. And that includes how many of these are going to be delivered until when. In case of the tanks, 180 are reportedly to be delivered between 2022 and 2025, and 212 howitzers between 2022 and 2026, and the rest of them will be produced in Poland through technology transfer.
Right, I see. And again, Tom, in your piece, you say South Korea's defense deal with Poland will, to a certain extent that is, benefit Ukraine because, quote, and I quote from your writing, it will offset its refusal to directly provide Ukraine with military equipment. May I ask you to elaborate again?
So my co-author and I made this argument at a time when South Korea was under a lot of pressure from the United States and other countries to supply the Ukrainians with lethal aid. That is small arms, guns, munitions, precision munitions, lethal drones, etc. Now, I think there's a lot to be said for the kinds of aid that South Korea was willing to send to the Ukrainians, be that rations, body armor, or the like, particularly when we see Russia's own forces so under-equipped and therefore so demoralized. But in any case, we essentially proposed that South Korea's willingness to provide advanced weapon systems, not to Ukraine, but to neighboring states like Poland, was significant because it was a second order or a once removed way for Korea to essentially provide Ukraine with lethal aid. In that sense, what I really mean is that by helping Poland to modernize its own armed forces more quickly, that allowed Poland to free up the kinds of older systems that the Ukrainian military was already proficient with and already using more widely, in a way that made it a lot easier and a lot quicker for Poland to supply Ukraine with the arms that it needed, rather than South Korea supplying new advanced systems that the Ukrainians would have to be trained on. And in that sense, it's as much a model for the provision of lethal aid that the US has pursued with other European countries supporting Ukraine, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe.
Right, I see. So let's now turn to factors that have served to perhaps facilitate Korea's defense-related exports in recent times. What do you care to highlight?
Well, first of all, I would say in recent times, I believe the situation in Ukraine, like Mr. Corben mentioned, has acted as a booster in the defense export industry. The deal with Poland suggests an arms race in the European region. So geopolitical instability is one. And of course, also geopolitical instability here in the region on the Korean Peninsula. Now, government policies have also facilitated an export-oriented defense industry, including the Defense Industry Development Act, which spurs local development of equipment and weapons to help meet foreign countries' requirements, as well as the Defense Science and Technology Innovation Promotion Act, which supports defense R&D and promotes technologies which are changing amid the fourth industrial revolution. Both of these came into effect last year. And speaking of technology, Korea's growing technology share with the U.S. is also regarded as one factor that facilitates the KArsenal industry.
Right, I see. And staying with technology, Tom, how does Korea's defense technology compare to that of its counterparts?
So thanks to decades of dedicated investment in Korea's industrial capacity and its research and development funding, we've really seen a lot of Korean firms display increasing proficiency in a wider and wider array of sophisticated defense technologies. Now, there's any number I could rattle off here, but to my mind, there are a couple of recent developments that really spring to mind. The first would be the increasingly stealthy and ballistic missile capable submarines that we see the Korean Navy fielding in growing numbers. But South Korea's unmanned systems, be that its UAVs or its underwater unmanned systems, are also increasingly sophisticated, and particularly in the way they use sophisticated AI algorithms. And there's a bit of a virtuous feedback loop here where the money from the defense sales that Korea makes through these sorts of advanced capabilities goes back into its R&D research and essentially allows these companies to build up more increasingly sophisticated platforms and capabilities. And in some cases, Korea's proficiency in these areas really outstrips comparable competitors in the West. But I mean, that said, there are still also some areas where Korean defense firms have some catching up to do, or they're looking to collaborate increasingly more with the US. So things that spring to mind for me here would be fifth generation stealth fighter aircraft like the F-35, long-range maritime patrol aircraft like the P-8, and battle management systems like the missile defense system you see used on many Korean naval vessels. So it's not surprising in that sense to see that the South Korean government is still very interested in procuring these types of advanced weapon systems from the US and in increasing the kinds of collaboration it does in these areas with the United States.
Right. And about the South Korean government, so both the former administration and the current administration have dedicated their intentions to boosting the country's standing as a major defense power. How are pundits explaining this rather ambitious objective?
Right, Sunny. The reason for why we're seeing this boost has a lot to do with government spending. So in the current administration as well as the former Moon administration. For instance, the defense budget in the Moon administration, the biggest raise was in 2019 by 8.2%. And also the current Yoon administration is looking for a 4.6% increase for next year. And that would bring the country's defense budget to a record high of more than 42 billion US dollars. So Seoul's defense ministry says the focus is on securing core military forces and to counter North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. The latter we've been seeing quite recently occurring in recent days and weeks. So despite emphasizing belt-tightening policies, what the Yoon administration is eye to eye on with the former Moon administration is the wish to grow military power. Now, here's something interesting that experts are mentioning. While South Korea's military technology is advancing, what is not is something that has got to do with what we spoke about last week. It's about demographics. South Korea's population is declining, and that means military enlistment will also fall as well. So that's why South Korea needs to rely on new military technology to make up for its shrinking manpower. And amid that, Korea is also preparing for OPCON, or the transfer of wartime operational control from Washington to Seoul, which requires proof of South Korea's military capability. So those are some of the objectives that experts link to South Korea's increasing ambitions in this market.
Right, I see. And Tom, you've said before, that is in your writing, that Korea's entry into the major defense league will ultimately serve the interests of competitors like the US. Again, perhaps you'd like to take this opportunity to explain that thought.
Sure. So commercially, it actually doesn't serve the interests of competitors in the US or elsewhere because Korean firms are able to offer increasingly sophisticated platforms at a very competitive price. But strategically, Korea's entry into the defense major league, again, as my co-author and I referred to in our article, is clearly in the interests of the United States and other like-minded countries. The war in Ukraine has made it quite clearer than ever, that the United States alone cannot arm its global suite of allies and partners in the way that it once did. In fact, the United States is already struggling and grappling with a lot of problems that have long afflicted its own defense industrial base. These problems aren't necessarily new, but the new impetus that's been given to arming frontline states against Russian and Chinese coercion by recent events has really highlighted that these problems haven't gone away, and if anything, that a lot of them are getting worse. So in that sense, for Korea to emerge as a viable alternative or perhaps preferred supplier when it comes to particular kinds of capabilities for these states, not only benefits the US in terms of strengthening frontline allies, but it really strengthens the national interests and helps to protect the national interests of these countries themselves, and ultimately helps uphold favorable regional orders in both Asia and Europe.
Tom, this is a question that Soa and I were actually talking about before we started this session. I was wondering, what are your words of advice to South Korea as it seeks to further perhaps advance its steps in the global defense market?
Sure. So I think there's probably two main points that I would like to make here. The first is that I think there is a need for South Korea to better coordinate its arms sales and its capability developments with other countries, with partners like the United States, Australia, Japan, and others, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. There are already a couple of examples that spring to my mind where Korean firms have been bidding against, allies and partners like the US for defense contracts in the Indo-Pacific. Now, obviously, this is part of healthy commercial competition, but strategically, it makes little sense for two or more countries who are of a like mind to bid for the same thing.
Right, of course.
And when, the companies from each country aren't necessarily offering the same standard, and some are better placed to provide certain kinds of capabilities.
Right.
And it's also quite hard for these recipient countries to absorb everything that's offered. So in that sense, I would advise South Korean defense firms and the South Korean government to coordinate more closely with allies. And the second point I'd like to make here is that
we have like about 5 seconds, Tom.
Sure. Korean defense firms are offering a full suite of technology transfer in the way that many Western countries aren't, particularly the United States.
Right.
And I wouldn't underestimate, and I would advise Korean defense firms not to underestimate exactly how appealing this is to many recipient countries in Asia and Europe.
Right, I see. All right, Tom, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. And Soa here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.